Right, I believe we can start now. Greetings, everyone, and a warm welcome to each of you gathered here today. As some of you may know already, my name is Benjamin Hoffman. I'm an associate professor specializing in 18th century French studies, and I serve as the director of OSU Center of Excellence. It brings me great pleasure to introduce Professor Tili Boon Cuillé from Washington University in St. Louis. So before I present our guests, I'd like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the individuals and institutions whose support has made Professor Boon Cuillé's visit to Columbus possible. A special thanks goes to the Department of French and Italian, and particularly to our chair, Professor Sagres Hiller, whose constant support has bolstered our lecture series. I'm also deeply appreciative of the assistance provided by the French Cultural Services in the US and the Consulate of France in Chicago. Furthermore, I extend my thanks to the various departments and centers at Ohio State that have contributed to this event: African American and African Studies, History, History of Art, Spanish and Portuguese, German languages and literature, Slavic and Eastern European languages and literatures, the Humanities Institute, and the Center for Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. Finally, I would like to express my appreciation to the private donors who generously support our lecture series. Following this lecture, I invite you to join us for a reception honoring our guests, and also it is my understanding that our colleague Professor Sagres Hiller will be leading a conversation in French about this lecture. So Tili Boon Cuillé received her degrees in comparative literature and theory from Princeton and the University of Pennsylvania. She is now professor of French and comparative studies and affiliate faculty in performing arts and film and media studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on 18th century French literature, philosophy, and aesthetics, particularly the debates about the musical, visual, and performing arts. She's the author of Narrative Interludes, Musical Tableaux in 18th century France, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2006, and Divining Nature, Aesthetics of Enchantment in Enlightenment France, published by Stanford University Press in 2021, a book that was made possible in part by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. She's also co-edited with Karina Smerslow, a book entitled Styles, Philosophy of the Passions, Sensibility, Society, and the Sister Arts, which was published by Bucknell University Press in 2013. Additionally, she co-convenes the 18th Century Interdisciplinary Salon at Washington University with her colleague Rebecca Merzbacher. So Professor Cuillé has published articles on natural history, opera, paintings, and a novel in journals such as 18th Century Studies, 18th Century Fiction, and Opera Quarterly, among others. In her seminars, students are invited to investigate French literature and the arts from the vantage of philosophy, aesthetics, literary theory, and cultural studies as well. She also designs comparative arts and opera studies courses structured around local exhibitions and performances. Her recent interests include the history of science and emotion, material cultures, and book illustration. So today's presentation is part of a current book project entitled Animate Objects, Magic Mediation and Illustration in French Libertine Fiction. She will participate this spring in the Bloomington workshop on the magical 18th century. So please join me in welcoming Professor Boon Cuillé to Ohio State. We are privileged to have her with us today.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I wanted to thank Professor Hoffman, Jennifer Illis, who was very helpful with all of the organization of this visit, and of course, all of you. I greatly enjoyed meeting your graduate students today at lunch, and I'm delighted to be here. I am venturing into new terrain with this project, and I'm very eager to hear your response, your questions. I know that you have specialists of shoes, of film, of fashion in the audience, so I felt that this would be a wonderful context in which to share some thoughts on the pink shoe over the centuries. So without further ado, I will begin. In his unfinished novel, Le Paysan Parvenu, Pierre de Marivaux charts the path of the young peasant Jacob from his arrival in Paris to the foyer of the Comédie Française. Notable in the stages of his social ascension is the following passage, when Jacob first gains admission to a Parisian boudoir and calls upon his benefactress. I found her reading while reclining on a sofa, her head on her hand in a very clean negligee, somewhat casually worn. Picture a skirt that does not fully reach the feet, disclosing a bit of the loveliest leg in the world, and a lovely leg is a beautiful thing in a woman. One of these cute feet had lost its shoe and was quite appealing in its nakedness. This touching posture was not lost on me. For the first time in my life, I sensed what the foot and the leg of a woman were worth. Until then, I had underestimated them. I had only seen women's faces and waists. I then learned they were women all over. I thus derived great pleasure from the sight of this lovely leg and pretty little foot without its slipper. The objects whose contemplation afford Jacob such pleasure, namely a woman's shoe, whether a soulier, mule, or pantoufle, barefoot and lovely leg, also attract the attention of the beholder of François Boucher's portrait of Madame de Pompadour. In The Essence of Style, Joan Dijon attributes, quote, the transformation of the shoe industry that made possible the current craze for luxe footwear, unquote, to Louis XIV, who liked to sport a jolie mule whenever possible. Yet the trend was upheld in the 18th century by his grandson's mistress. The shoe and the foot likewise attract the attention of the young man depicted in Honoré Fragonard's The Swing, whose gaze inevitably follows the leg right up to the private parts these objects are thought to or displace. Amy Wingard has situated the works of Nicolas Edme Rétif de la Bretonne in the context of the 18th century fascination with women's shoes and feet, recalling that just as his nemesis, the Marquis de Sade, gave his name to sadism, Rétif came close to giving his name to fetishism, but settled instead for the somewhat questionable distinction of being the first documented foot and shoe fetishist in French literature. While Wingard has provided an exceptional reading of Rétif's works in conjunction with the advent of Freudian fetishism and the rise of sexology as a discipline, I wish to revisit them in light of two other varieties of fetishism that they likewise anticipate. In her reading, Wingard calls attention to the semantic carryover from fetishism's initial religious context to the social, sentimental, sexual domain, preserved in a constellation of terms highlighting the fetish's magical powers, including relic, idol, and talisman. Yet the mist-enveloped regions of the religious world is likewise the context that Karl Marx evoked for his discussion of commodity fetishism. There, the social relation between men assumes the fantastic form of a relation between things. Luce Irigaray has convincingly expanded the category of such things to include women, and yet in the narrative I propose to analyze, women are further reduced to their own particular overdetermined signifiers, namely the foot or the shoe. While these signifiers clearly have a use, they are more heavily associated with women's exchange value. In turning my attention from the Freudian to the Marxian fetish, I wish to preserve the sacred or magical overtones that characterize not only the objects qua commodities, but also the nature of the relationships they catalyze. In The Economy of Character, Deirdre Lynch reminds us of the expanding print and market culture in which the 18th century novel evolved. She understands economy both to mean less is more and to refer to circulation and exchange. Playing upon the use of the term character to mean types as well as typeface, she considers how so many marks on a page came to be perceived not as flat, but round, as having an identity and feelings akin to the self and capable of inducing a reciprocal response in the reader. Her study suggests that persons, if not their persona, are on occasion the sum of their personal effects. Both characters and their possessions, in other words, belong to the history of animation of objects as consumers of literature and material goods endowed them with sentiment and agency and derived sentiment and agency from them in turn. It was less their interiority than their social mobility that enabled characters and their belongings to enter into and catalyze relationships, functioning as so many signs, things, or commodities that had a certain currency. Rétif de la Bretonne was keenly aware of and very much invested in 18th century print culture. Having begun his career as a typographe or typographer, apprentice at the Maison Fournier in Auxerre, followed by 12 years of working for various printers in Paris, he became head typographer, prote, chez Quillot in the years 1764 through 7, in charge of format, presentation, character, ornament, and punctuation, before becoming an author in his own right, setting, printing, and correcting his proofs as he composed them. He dedicated a treatise entitled The Glossographe to the standardization of spelling and was described as a graphomane, or what he referred to as an autoromane, someone with graphomania or possessed with the irresistible impulse to write. The attention Lynch calls to the composition of character and the animation of objects puts us in mind not only of commodity fetishism, but also of Anne Enlin Cheng's ornamentalism. In her study, Cheng likens ornamentalism to and differentiates it from Freudian and Marxian fetishism, suggesting that it is more constitutive than reductive of the subject-object it represents, animating rather than petrifying it. The subject-object that primarily interests Cheng is the yellow woman, who has fallen out of the annals of history and theory. Unlike Black women, who are inevitably and unduly associated with nature and the flesh, yellow women are both constituted, perpetuated, and effaced by the artifice that adorns them. Like the traits or accessories that overdraw characters, ornament tends to be associated with superfluity or excess. Cheng likens ornamentalism to Orientalism, to which it's semantically related, stating that Orientalism is a critique, ornamentalism a theory of being. This theory of being considers the alchemy between things and persons, which seem to be mutually constitutive, that Cheng characterizes as subject-as-object enchantment. While Orientalism and ornamentalism tend to go hand in glove, as it were, Cheng emphasizes that, quote, we do not need the presence of a yellow woman to invoke the logic of yellow femininity, unquote. So, it's with the relevance of commodity fetishism and ornamentalism in mind that I would like to return to the print and market culture of 18th century France to analyze Rétif de la Bretonne's Le Pied de Fanchette ou Le Soulier couleur de rose. While the title's implicit reference to Charles Perrault's Cendrillon, Cinderella, ou Le Petit Pantoufle en Verre is readily recognizable, the heroine's name, Fanchette, as well as her character, are more evocative of other versions of the Cinderella story circulating in Perrault's milieu. As Anne Duggan reveals in The Lost Princess, Madame d'Aulnoy's version of the tale, Finette Cendrillon, remains as well known in Northern Europe as Perrault's is in the States. Duggan surmises that while both versions were adaptations of Giambattista Basile's earlier tales, d'Aulnoy borrowed the name Finette from L'Héritier's Clever Princess, fusing the two to create Finette Sanders, a not-so-passive Cinderella invested with considerably more agency than Perrault's model. Duggan's description of Finette as a mystery woman and fashion icon whose prince falls in love with her shoe anticipates the role Rétif accords to the heroine of Fanchette's foot. In Making the Marvelous, Rory Bloom contends that Perrault's contemporaries sought to disenchant and demystify the marvelous, identifying it less with magic than with the decorative arts. I wish to emphasize the enchantment or mystification preserved in this transition as magical objects were reconceived or reanimated as components of commodity culture. While Rétif may have been aware of and drawn upon the multiple versions of the Cinderella story circulating in France, I also want to call attention to the many references to the Oriental tale that have remained by and large overlooked. The epigraph to Rétif's tale establishes the parallel between East and West from the outset, recalling Jean-Jacques Rousseau's reflections on what signifies nudity in the woman. Quote, a young Chinese woman showing the tip of her toe covered in shod would make more of a sensation in Beijing than the most beautiful woman in the world dancing naked at the foot of the Taiget Mountains, unquote. When Fanchette's shoe becomes the subject of a dinner conversation and is compared to another that has been seen before, the hypothesis is that the owner of the other shoe must be Chinese. The characters and events in the narrative are witnessed, moreover, by two étrangers, foreigners or strangers, described simply as rich inhabitants of the French colonies in Asia, whose identity is not revealed until the end of the story. While the French colonies in Asia remained under the jurisdiction of the French East India Company until 1769, when Rétif first published his novella, the witnesses of the tale are referred to throughout as the two Asians, without specifying their country of origin. This blurs the distinction between East and South Asia and misleads the reader into thinking the foreigners are from Asia as opposed to simply having made their fortunes there. Not knowing what to make of the events of the narrative, these onlookers look at each other in surprise and disbelief, exclaiming, quote, is it a dream, or are we in the land of fairies? But these are not the giants of the Arabian Nights who carry off beauties. These are much more dangerous monsters. These are dévots, unquote, situating the narrative once again at the conjunction of the fairy and the Oriental tale. The witnesses turn out to be two French merchants who made their fortune in the French colonies, then lost it in the Battle of Wandiwash, where Pondicherry fell to the English during the 7 Years' War. By the end of the narrative, their fortune is restored and their reputation reestablished once their vessels make it safely to Lorient, headquarters of the French East India Company. While the French fascination for India likewise originated in late 17th century salon culture, as Faith Beasley has revealed, Rétif's narrative is one of several satirical repurposings of the Oriental tale that serves as a commentary on late 18th century commodity culture. Rétif's novella was purportedly inspired by the sight of a pretty shoe. The first time we glimpse Fanchette is somewhat unusual in that the editor exceptionally describes her face. Fanchette's lily-white skin, rosy red cheeks, and ebony hair are reminiscent of Perrault's Snow White. His gaze continues to work its way downwards, however, until it comes to dwell on her foot, enclosed in a pink shoe with a 5-inch heel. Rather than accosting the young woman, the editor accosts the foot under his breath, stating that while it is not carried on Persian or Turkish carpets, it will always have a throne in his heart. The subsequent descriptions of Fanchette's foot bypass her face entirely, which her admirers either cannot see, gloss over, or never reach, so entirely does her foot monopolize their attention. Such is the case of her first suitor, de Lucenville, who no sooner espies Fanchette's foot than she flees, preventing him from seeing her face, and yet extrapolating from the one to the other, he insists that if her foot is beautiful, her face can hardly be ugly. De Lucenville's rival, Dolcens, likewise first espies her foot while her back is turned. Declaring her foot to be one of Paris's many marvels, Dolcens too speculates as to whether her face is as beautiful. By virtue of focusing on her foot and the shoe she loses, rather than her face, the Asian who witnesses her story does not manage to identify her or reveal his own identity until the very end of the narrative. Fanchette's foot thus becomes a stand-in less for her private parts than for her facial features. Rétif situates his novella in the middle-class context of Parisian cloth merchants whose shops lined the streets of Saint-Denis and Saint-Honoré and who imported fabrics from England and India. These fabrics were fashioned into clothes, shoes, and easy seats, including sofas, ottomans, sultanas, and turquoise, whose exotic patterns were subsequently rendered in porcelain or described in paintings. Rétif showcases not only the colorful, decorated, and embroidered fabrics used to make the shoes, but the height of the heels, expressing distaste for the flats that came into vogue during the Napoleonic era. Whether the foot sets off the shoe or the shoe the foot is a subject of an animated discussion during a dinner party. As the petite maîtresse remarks, quote, "A pretty foot decked out in a pretty shoe is a useful charm," unquote. This powerful combination renders Fanchette the victim of no less than 4 attempted rapes. Ravished by her foot, her suitors attempt to ravish her in turn. The useful charm also solicits 3 different sorts of proposals, as her suitors variously offer to marry, keep, or hire her. Fonchette's foot and shoe are alternately referred to as her most precious jewel, good, or gift, terms likewise used to designate her virtue, innocence, or honor. The correlation between Fonchette's womanhood, her foot, and her shoe is thus established within a system of circulation and exchange. Fonchette's father had warned her against becoming one of those women who are too lavishly adorned with such ornaments. Her governess echoes this sentiment when she encourages her charge to renounce the gifts that her guardian has lavished upon her. Quote, "Take off these trinkets and jewels. They are, on a poor girl, sad signs that she is for sale, or perhaps has already been sold," unquote. Fonchette distinguishes herself from the common walk of women by refusing to sacrifice her honor to the worship of these false idols, baubles, and trinkets. Regardless of whether she wears them, however, she remains associated with them throughout the narrative. She is the only coveted good in the store where her suitors espy her. Nothing was to their liking in the merchant's store except Fonchette. Her foot and her shoe are variously referred to as jewels, a term that was also used to refer to women's private parts, as we know from Diderot's The Indiscreet Jewels. That the one, shoe, was considered a fair exchange for the other, sex, becomes clear when the Count says, when handing Fonchette's pink shoe to her governess in an attempt to conclude a transaction, quote, "I am only exchanging this for something more precious. Let the lovely child know that he who saved her awaits with impatience the only recompense worthy of such a great service," unquote. In the course of the dinner conversation at the Petite Maison, however, the correlation of a woman's foot or shoe with her virtue is inflected to suggest that a beautiful foot is the sign of a beautiful soul, and announce the conclusion that, quote, "a perfect foot and leg are the sign of an excellent character, and of all the virtues as all the charms," unquote. This inflection coincides with the re-evaluation of luxury goods at the time as vehicles not of vice, but of the finer feelings. Women's feet, Rétif proclaims, are the sum of their charms, whether equated with their virtue or responsible for its loss. As the author remarks, the plot's originality resides in the fact that, quote, "all the events are occasioned by the heroine's pretty foot," unquote. Fonchette's feet, the narrator affirms, are ultimately responsible for her conquest, misery, and deliverance, and yet we might ultimately attribute this threefold function less to her feet than her shoes. Though she receives several pairs from her guardian at the outset of the narrative, made of variegated moiré silks with contrasting heels and embroidery, the 2 singled out as masterpieces are a pink pair with green heels and a green pair with pink. The attentive reader may be tempted to follow the fate of these shoes throughout the narrative, an undertaking that proves to be no small task. De Lucenville accompanies his marriage proposal with a jewelry box containing a diamond ring, a necklace, and earrings. With a sleight of hand, he deftly swipes her pink pair of shoes, purportedly as a memento, offering to return them in exchange for her troth, making his jewelry box seem less of a gift than a bargaining chip. Fonchette is therefore obliged to resort to the green pair, one of which she loses when de Lucenville saves her from the financier's unwelcome advances. The Asian picks up and preciously guards the lost shoe, seeking its wearer until the end of the narrative. Fonchette, meanwhile, rewards de Lucenville and redeems his theft by asking him to return her shoes, then bestowing them upon him of her own free will, along with her portrait and a hair bracelet, which her lover refers to as so many jewels. He offers her a new pair in return, embroidered by his sister and also pink. Fonchette is thus freshly shod, but 1 pair of shoes remains among the keepsakes in de Lucenville's possession, and another will serve, Cinderella fashion, as the key to her identity by the end of the story. The embroidered shoes Fonchette receives from de Lucenville then take on a life of their own, becoming alternately responsible for her undoing and deliverance. Each time she dons them, she becomes the victim of an attempted rape. Because Fanchette loses a shoe en route to the Marquis's domain, while his servants forcibly remove the remaining shoe once inside, de Lucenville, who comes to her rescue, is able to retrace her route and to confirm her presence in the castle. While Fanchette does not learn the lesson that her shoes are likely to get her into trouble, she does learn that she can use them to get her out of it. When carried off by Apatheon, Fanchette plants a shoe on the windowsill as an indication of her whereabouts, hoping someone will come to her rescue. Meanwhile, the Count finds the matching shoe in Apatheon's house, giving him a clue as to where Fanchette is sequestered. These adventures, which unfold simultaneously, are recounted on facing pages twice over, first from the narrator's and later from Fanchette's perspective, producing a remarkable split-screen effect in which we find ourselves following not Fanchette's footsteps, but rather her shoes. Recognizing them as her handiwork, de Lucenville's sister also identifies the shoe the Asian shows her as belonging to Fanchette, who produces its twin, leading to a series of recognition scenes in which they discover they are related, their fortune is restored, and the mystery is solved. These recognition scenes are catalyzed not by an identifying birthmark or bassinet, but rather by Fanchette's shoes, which bear the imprint of her foot and are as unique and unmistakable as a fingerprint, handwriting, a lock of hair, or a portrait. Throughout, they are variously referred to as ornaments, jewels, or masterpieces, and are frequently decked out with embroidery, lace, and buckles, which we are given to understand can be added, removed, or lost, allowing Fanchette to accessorize at will. Fanchette's shoes both reveal and conceal her outer beauty, face, and inner beauty, soul. Considered the key to her identity, they are used to discover it. Considered of equal value to her virtue, they are used to attack or defend it. Fanchette comes to believe that they are endowed with the power to protect her, trusting the gift from her lover to preserve her for him. Yet her shoes also become the means of restoring her family and fortune. We thus witness the alchemy between things and persons that Chang characterizes as subject as object enchantment. Without Fanchette's shoe, the Asian, who turns out to be de Lucenville's father and Fanchette's uncle, would never have found its wearer, and his identity would have remained as mysterious as hers. Fanchette's shoes thus have the pragmatic function of Hansel and Gretel's breadcrumbs or a series of clues in a whodunit. Yet they also enable the narrator to reconstitute the narrative. Rétif's tale culminates in a remarkable tying up of loose ends when Fanchette's guardian is revealed to be responsible for the death of her parents, the loss of the family fortune, and the indefinite delay of her uncle's return. Yet the neatness of the conclusion belies the original state of the manuscript. After the fashion of Cervantes' Don Quixote, the English comic novel, and French pseudo-memoirs, Rétif alludes to a manuscript that portends to be a true history rather than a fiction. Rétif himself has been described as an écrivain éditeur, author-editor. Riveted by the sight of Fanchette's foot, the editor enters the cloth merchant's shop, and de Lucenville's governor, eyewitness to Fanchette's story, offers him the manuscript we are about to read, which will promote him from a mere novelist to a historian. Much to their dismay, they learn that one of the servants has transformed the pages of the manuscript into papillotes. These bonbons were likewise an invention of the late 18th century and consisted of love notes, riddles, or verses written on small pieces of paper folded within brightly colored wrappers containing chocolate or fruit candies, a French version of the fortune cookie. While the editor promptly gives the manuscript up for loss, the servant attempts to reconstitute it once he understands its worth. The process of reconstitution leaves the authenticity of the manuscript in doubt. After unfolding the papillote, the servant smooths out the pages and puts them in order. The manuscript then passes through the hands of no fewer than 3 people who, recognizing its potential, proceed to edit, correct, mutilate, augment, expurgate, reinstitute, and embellish it. As the terms multiply, it becomes increasingly unlikely that the version we are reading corresponds to the original. The only indication that the pages may be in the right order and the manuscript complete, or that the series of editors ultimately managed to restore what was excised, lies in Fanchette's shoes. If by the end of the narrative, the missing shoes are accounted for and the separated or mismatched pairs realigned, chances are the manuscript itself has been successfully reconstructed. Not only the identity of the heroine, the villain, and the stranger depend upon the fate of the shoes, therefore, but so does the very status of the manuscript itself. So this playful commentary on the status of the manuscript is indeed a reflection on our reading material, which Rétif put through 4 successive editions before settling upon its final form. In a single paragraph that appeared in the last edition of his work, published in 1800, which contains the first reference to women's shoes as sacred fetishes, Rétif cites a famed example of a pretty foot to persuade us of its power to inflame and retain a lover. Quote, Marie Antoinette had a large foot, but of the most beautiful shape, unquote. Like Cinderella, her shoe is en vert, written not to mean fur, vert, or glass, vert, but green, vert. 3 homonyms. Her bodyguard erects an altar to the shoe, which he surrounds with silk stockings, bracelets, and ribbons. In Queen of Fashion, What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, Caroline Weber evokes the French queen's inclination towards commodity fetishism, recalled in modern couturiers' frequent tributes to her legendary sense of style. Weber's study suggests that the French queen, like the Yellow Woman, was both constructed and concealed by her apparel, a dynamic interplay that situates her between remembrance and oblivion. Like Cheng, Weber draws attention to the French queen's sartorial politics, to the agency she acquired as she navigated her complex status as sovereign, subject, and object. Sofia Coppola's 2006 film, Marie Antoinette, likewise serves as an encomium to the queen's fondness for poufs, dresses, shoes, fans, feathers, and sweets. The pink shoe that first appears on Fonchette's foot in Rétif's novella reappears on Kirsten Dunst's foot in Coppola's film, which has been referred to as a thoroughly modern confection. In it, according to a New Yorker review, quote, we get wigs that look like desserts, cookies that look like jewels, and shoes designed for the film by Manolo Blahnik that appear to have been stitched together at night by the world's most sophisticated elves, unquote. The surreal quality of the accessories is intensified by the pastel coloring reminiscent of the Rococo, a period that inspired Blahnik's signature style, as evident in the 2019 exhibit An Inquiring Mind, Manolo Blahnik at the Wallace Collection, alongside Fragonard's The Swing. Yet Marie Antoinette appropriates these accessories, which were at first foisted upon her. As the princess arrives at the national border in Coppola's film, she is obliged to divest herself of her Austrian trappings to assume the costume and hairstyle considered worthy of the French queen. She feels exposed when roused each morning and obliged to dress in public. Gradually, however, the young queen assumes ownership of her accessories, whether she uses them for daily attire, to act in the operatic productions she wishes she could see in Paris, or to recreate the bergerie, where she sheds her finery and assumes the feigned simplicity of a shepherdess. Her move from dressed mannequin to dress designer, from marionette to machinist, demonstrates her ability to acquire agency by animating, repurposing, and deploying the ornaments around her. She thus invokes Cheng's logic of yellow femininity. Fonchette's shoe, which seems to be a perfect fit for Kirsten Dunst in Marie Antoinette, is then tantalizingly transferred to Israel Broussard's foot when he dons pink Louboutin stilettos borrowed from Paris Hilton's shoe closet in Coppola's 2013 The Bling Ring, a celebration or a scathing critique of American consumer culture. As in the original Cinderella stories, the desire to try on the shoes proves infectious. Yet while the Parisians who try on Fonchette's shoe cannot wear it because it is too small, the teenagers who try on Paris Hilton's shoe cannot wear it because it's too large, size 11, creating a special bond between the shoe and its rightful owner. Fiona Handyside characterizes Coppola's films as true crime stories about shoes that commence with shoe montages, yet, quote, move beyond Jameson's account of the art object shoe into an emotional relation to the designer's shoe, unquote. Another New Yorker review remarks, however, that Coppola, quote, offers not psychological, sociological, or moral portraits of her characters, but aesthetic ones, which come with the built-in risk of partaking in the aesthetic of the characters she depicts, unquote, rendering us either covetous or complicit. The role of Rebecca Ahn in Coppola's film, realized by Katie Chang, is based upon that of Rachel Lee, the Korean-American ringleader of the Bling Ring. Erin Lee Carr's documentary, The Ringleader, The Case of the Bling Ring, that came out just last year in 2023, allows us to distinguish between Coppola's character and the actual person she portrayed, who accepted an interview for the first time in nearly 15 years after the indictment. The documentary reveals that Rachel, the daughter of divorced parents whose father was a professional gambler, was acutely aware of being one of the rare Korean Americans in her school district, was demoted from Calabasas High and sent to Indian Hills Continuation School for swiping a pair of Uggs, experienced FOMO with respect to brand names, social media, reality TV, and celebrity culture, and became hooked to Xanax, which suppressed her emotions and enabled her to become a part of this material world. In explanation of this phenomenon, Rachel remarks that, quote, surprisingly, you can feel energy of a person. You can feel when somebody is in a home. When I took their stuff, it was an instant feeling of, ooh, I'm powerful, unquote. Because Rachel kept a low profile until now, declining any interviews, she has remained in the interim an enigma, according to Amy Kaufman, staff writer for the Los Angeles Times. It is this enigma, reinforced by the media, that Coppola so effectively captures in the character of Rebecca Ahn. I wish to suggest that Rebecca is not portrayed, as Handyside claims, as, quote, just another white middle-class girl in Coppola's film. Instead, this heist, the most successful in history and the first that used social media to identify its targets, could easily figure in the list of 19th and 20th century court cases Chang enumerates that have served to inevitably associate yellow women with the ornamentation and accessorizing that suggests her value resides in her exterior rather than her interior, her values, morals, or self-worth, rendering her, in a sense, superficial. While we are frequently given a privileged glimpse of Broussard's character Marc, portraying Nick Prugo, ruminating in his bedroom, subject to various conflicting emotions, and possessed of a certain interiority, we tend to see Rebecca, who remains cool, calm, and aloof throughout through Marc's eyes. Tellingly, Marc remains in the passenger seat while Rebecca takes the wheel, masterminding their operations. When their luck runs out, true to character, Marc confesses all, including loving Rebecca like a sister, while Rebecca disavows any connection to either the stolen goods or her partners in crime. All effective ties, whether to people or to things, are denied. And yet Coppola clearly draws a parallel, showcased in the title of the 2010 Vanity Fair article that served as an inspiration for the film, The Suspects Wore Louboutins, between the sartorial fascination of the members of the Bling Ring and that of their victims, including Paris Hilton, Orlando Bloom, Megan Fox, and Lindsay Lohan, among others. As Chang suggests, a close correlation exists between yellow women and the culture of consumption and display, whether in art, film, or fashion, that both constitutes and conceals them. This is the culture on which Emma Watson's character Nikki, portraying Alexis Nyers, learns to capitalize, but which other members of the Bling Ring arguably fall prey. While Marc vocally rejects and Nikki performatively embraces this consumer culture, once the veil is torn, Rebecca characteristically remains unavailable for comment, constituting for those investigating the crime spree an enigma, to whom the role of mastermind or ringleader can conveniently be attributed. And yet we might consider that in helping themselves to what is not theirs and decking themselves out in designer finery that belongs to others, the members of the Bling Ring, especially Rebecca Ahn and more recently Rachel Lee, made the critique of consumer culture possible by calling our attention to its ascendancy over American adolescence. The pink shoe, then, not only takes on a life of its own that we can trace from the streets of Paris and Rétif's narrative to Paris Hilton's shoe closet in Coppola's films, but also lends agency to its wearers. Though she risks both ravishing and being ravished each time she dons them, Fanchette not only considers her shoes to be endowed with the power to protect her, but learns to place them strategically in order to control her fate and determine the outcome of her story. Marie Antoinette, similarly, moves from being dressed or dressed down to dressing up, decking herself out from head to foot, wigs to shoes, in what ultimately serves as a pastiche of her foreign, fragile position. Judith Butler associates pastiche with politics, protest, and a prise de pouvoir. Rebecca, finally, checks the doors of cars, mailboxes, and houses, not breaking, but entering, and treating the contents as her own, appropriating the ornaments of those whose lifestyle she covets, for if she can live in their houses, drive their cars, and wear their shoes, wherein ultimately lies the distinction between self and other. She therefore moves, if not from a have to a have, if not from a have not to a have, at least from a have less to a have more, shifting shape as she acquires ornaments or accessorizes. Without their accessories, all three characters would remain somewhat inaccessible. Fanchette, Marie Antoinette, and Rebecca all gain agency and celebrity, or at least notoriety, forging identities and relationships with other characters, readers, and viewers via animating objects, particularly the pink shoe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We have 15 minutes for questions, so please go ahead. Who wants to start?
Yes. Why pink? It's an excellent question. In fact, the original shoe, if we consult D'aulnoy's version of the Cinderella story, was red velvet surrounded with pearls. There is controversy about Perrault's shoe because he originally spelled the ver, V-A-I-R, which would suggest a fur shoe. This became translated with the V-E-R-R-E, which is a glass slipper, right? So that's the version we may be familiar with. But yes, I simply followed the breadcrumbs, and as it so happens, the predominant color of the Rococo, with its privileging of pastels, right, which you can read about in Melissa Hyde's Making Up the Rococo, happens to be the pinks, the light blues, and the yellows that you would see in porcelain of that era, Sévigné porcelain. So I think it must have been the affinity with that color, which just so happens to be the shoe out of all of the choices that Israel Broussard dons as the only member of the Bling Ring who can fit into Paris's shoes, right? So I was just capitalizing on the color, but I think that for Manolo Blahnik, it's very much a revival of a color that was characteristic of the Rococo because he has such an affinity for that era.
Do you know if that period was associated with femininity or
not necessarily, because the shoes were not limited to women, right, at the time. So it was Louis XIV purportedly who set the trend, right? And I showed you primarily the famed women's portraits from the era, but I could just as easily, for example, have taken, the portrait of Louis where he's showing a little leg, right? The garter, put the male calf into, showed it to advantage, and he had a preference for high heels. So yes, the 18th century paintings tend to show more women, but, and of course, Rétif's text is fully focused on the woman's shoe. But it was a status symbol to have the higher heel, and it was gender non-specific for most of the early modern period. Yeah. And I'm completely open to any questions, suggestions, recommendations, because I've covered a lot of terrain. So anything you're... Yeah, go ahead.
There's so much to think with here. Thank you for a really interesting talk with quite an arc,
Yeah.
I think, over time periods and genres too. So I'm a medievalist, and so I think a lot about clothing and literature is typically allegorical. I mean, if it's in the story, it's creating something, right? If you bother to have the idea there, and just sort of interestingly, medieval shoes are really not sexy. They're practical. They're grounded. They're dirty, right? They're the thing that gets dirty. But one of the things, if you look, like if you go to a museum and you see how these skirts are constructed in the early modern period, they have, pannier and they have rolls and stuffing under them. So they're essentially a hollow shell. So that's quite a bit different than anything we wear now, or that they were wearing before the 16th century.
Right.
So the shoe is a kind of a dangerous liminal point.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of empty space under an early modern skirt that's closed other eras. I wonder if you want to play with whether there's any symbolism and what it means to kind of be at that pivot point, that kind of hinge between inside and out.
Yeah, and I really was quite fascinated myself by this potential connection between traveling signifiers, right? The shoe on the one hand and the print on the other, as Rétif indulges these two passions of his, right? Because the documentation of him as foot fetishist is very clear. Rétif writes abundantly, and he actually did apparently, draft in the morning and typeset that same drafting in the afternoon and then have to undo it and redo it. So this is kind of a constant process of quasi-autobiographical, quasi-novelistic output, right? He writes in the wake of Rousseau, and it is very hard to tell not only where one story leaves off and another one begins, but where one genre leaves off and another begins. But he also left abundant documentary evidence of his own life. Monsieur Nicolas is meant to be his life, right? So his foot fetishism and shoe fetishism is documented throughout. So this is just actually the most finished, worked upon nugget of that larger literary production. But I really think that it is a tipping point in terms of both how he's clearly drawing on the two-tailed traditions, which were sort of all the rage in France at the time, weaving those together, but also using the shoe absolutely symbolically of, it's being used as a fetish, right? But instead of replacing the private parts, it's also replacing the face, it's also replacing the character, also the soul, right? So it's performing a number of functions in this text. It's very erotically charged, right? But he has set it in the consumer culture, right, that predates Marx, right? Marx is studying a phenomenon that has been around for a while by that time. And it's also a colonialist setting, right? Where all of these goods are coming in from a kind of writ large Orient, right? They're attracting a lot of attention. They're having a huge impact on French fashion, but he is using them to actually weave together that narrative, and it's almost a prototype of the detective story, right? It reads like a whodunit. So I think that I'm interested in both what it symbolizes in terms of fanchette, right? But also how it's used structurally in terms of the narrative and how she's able to use it strategically, which is what I see as very much still a part of consumer culture. And sometimes we overanalyze that and sometimes we underanalyze that somewhat, which is what I was suggesting in this distinction that we're only now able to make between the original, the real character and the literary character or film character of Rachel Lee Rebecca Ahn. Does that get it?
Sure, that's lots of fun.
Yeah.
There's a question of irony, and fetishism
Yeah.
implies almost a religious
Yes.
approach to it.
Yes.
So what I hear you saying is that there's no ironic play here, that there's, or is there?
I think that Retief's text, and I think Coppola's films, which are also, somewhere between historical truth and fictional, right, framing, because they're very much film d'auteur, right? She puts her own stamp on each successive film, including her very last one. I absolutely think that Retief's text is extremely playful. He is thoroughly enjoying, the travails of his heroine, right? Getting her out of a number of tight spots. And it's almost the cinematographic effect that ultimately reaches. That is kind of the link that I'm attempting to make, because we both have films that are, and shoe designers who are nostalgic about that era. And we have authors who are writing, in a sense, I hate to use the phrase well ahead of their time, but you see what I'm saying in terms of anticipating other genres, other economic theories, and other, even in terms of sexology, right? He's kind of paved the way for subsequent analyses. So yes, very playful, but also very redolent. I would say that religious overtone, to my mind, is very much maintained, right? In some of the comments of what it is that this meant, right? What it means to adolescence. And people can, join in because you're part of this culture that I was characterizing, right? As someone who did not necessarily live through it. But what it means for someone to be able to stand in somebody else's shoes, which has a very different connotation in 18th century France, right? It's at the base of pitié, it's at the base of sensibilité, like the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes is usually that ability to empathize with and understand them, right? So this is a literalization of that, but I think it preserves it at the same time.
Nice art, thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is was there a turning point or event that shoe became more of a power symbol for women and started expanding beyond aestheticization? And then my second question, kind of in the same vein, was there also a turning point where high-heeled shoes became a means for women to kind of put men in positions of submission, and power plays a dynamic in that way as well? So not necessarily reversing fetishization, but expanding it to meet different.
Right, I understand. That's a great question. For me, in this text, the fact that he added in the very last version of this tale, the encomium to Marie Antoinette, that to me is an association of the high-heeled shoe with a woman who garnered a great deal of symbolic power, even though clearly she lost her head in the revolution, so she did not ultimately prevail. Nevertheless, she has lived on. If you look at Caroline Weber's What Marie Antoinette Wore to the Revolution, really, she's looking at how contemporary fashion designers continue to pay tribute to the trend-setting capacity of the French queen, who ultimately did not have any of the forms of power that were attributed to her that led to her being beheaded during the revolution. Germaine de Staël wrote a very touching defense of the French queen, explaining that she did not wield any of the forms of power that the French people were attributing to her, or the French nobility were attributing to her at the time. But she is recognized at having had this one niche, right, of fashion, right, for which she is remembered. So I would say that that's perhaps one of the first alliances specifically with a woman in power and the source of her power as being linked to fashion. Right after the queen was beheaded, with the onset of the Napoleonic era, women started wearing flats. So the heel disappeared for a certain while, right, and then came back. So in terms of the subjugation of men and the raising and lowering of the heel, I think you'd have to follow that through the 19th century to see whether, which I haven't done, but to see whether that was kind of a back and forth, right, that was negotiated in the course of that century, or whether women, the shoe, the heel, and power disappeared for a while during the reification of gender norms in the 19th century, which is perfectly possible, and then came back, say, roaring 20s, when a lot of fashion choices, right, and with Chanel, for example, a lot of fashion choices started to be associated with women's power, right, and liberation. Does that make sense? Yeah. Great.
We may have time for a final question. Two final questions.
Okay, yeah.
Would you like to go for us?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Love the presentation. I know that we said that King Louis had also started the trend of wearing heels at this time. I myself am wearing heels right now.
Wonderful.
I wonder if we ever see the same time or same type of fetishization with men at this time or going forward with heels as we do about women, or is it more trans-branding just as like power than it can be like sexualization? And I'm also wondering if like men wearing heels or women could ever be seen as like a symbolization of like queerness at this time as well.
Right, okay, great.
Makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So I would say that absolutely in terms of Louis XIV, the portrait that's best known of him in full regalia, showing his legs to advantage with the heel, which he wore on every occasion possible. He also danced in ballets. He did public performance, a bit like Marie Antoinette aspired to do. Was associated with power, right? Because this is a state portrait, right? And he was there in his wig, very much like, and robes and the heel are all aligned in sense as his public-facing self-presentation of Louis as Sun King, right? So Marie Antoinette then appropriating the tall wig and the dress and the shoes are kind of a power play then that would be an appropriation of the king's power for the queen, whose power symbols were relatively empty, as you suggested, right? So queerness, absolutely, but not the shoe in and of itself, not the outfit necessarily. Breeches, right, would be a much greater indicator. Breeches or a dress, right, would be a greater indicator of whether someone is styling themselves in a more masculine or feminine vein at the time than the height of the shoe or the presence of the wig. Okay, I have a student who's just done a wonderful dissertation on trouser rolls in opera from the early modern period on, using a queer theory perspective. And the question of wearing breeches or what will become known as pants in the 19th century, right, was policed, right? Whereas other things such as face makeup, right, footwear, and hairstyles were not, right? So the way of signifying identity was much less reified than in 19th century convention. Yeah. Yeah.
Final questions, or we'll end with you?
Hi.
Hello, my name is Grace. Thank you for the presentation.
Yeah.
Stand up so you can hear it. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. My name is Grace. Heels have been interesting kind of shoe because they first started off as a very practical means in Korea for horseback riding, I believe.
Okay.
But then now I think any person who's worn a heel can agree that they're very uncomfortable to wear after a certain period of time.
Uh-huh.
And so I was wondering if the practicality and design of the shoe itself
Mhm.
has an effect on its ability as a status symbol and its representation of femininity.
Yeah, it's interesting because, so thank you for sharing the origins of the high heel and its lending itself to horseback riding originally. I grew up in an era where women and pants and suit coats and a low heel were aligned in the public view, or at least in the academic circles I grew up in, as sort of the working outfit, right? The signs of a certain intellectual or cultural capital associated with the ability to join the workforce, right? I think that that's not the case anymore. And I was really interested to see in the series Madam Secretary, if you've been following that at all, that she wears kind of the suit and the blouse with the tie, that is the blouse is tied, right, as a substitute for a cravat, right? But she keeps the incredibly high heels, which may have, she may be strapped into them, but she's keeping the high heels. And as we see more and more women filmmakers dedicate series to women in power in American politics, I continue to see the high-heeled shoe associated specifically with women in power. So I wonder whether, getting back to the symbolic value, right, of the shoe, it is not still associated in the public imaginary as not really having a use value anymore, but having the symbolic value of, I'm going to put my big girl boots on and use the pointy end, right? I believe is the expression, right? So yeah, I'm interested in the longer history. What do you think? Do you think that there's a connection? Because you sounded quite knowledgeable.
Not particularly, but I think there's a gender aspect.
Yeah.
Because I believe horseback riding probably, to my knowledge, was not as viable, was a viable option for women back then.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe it changes based on the binary gender.
Mm-hmm.
Feel as an object of, oh, this is practical for us versus, oh, this
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah, and the domains in which that power is wielded, right, whether it be DC or Hollywood, right, might be a little bit different. But I think the height of the heel and the thickness of the heel, right, have changed over the years with other fashion trends in terms of symbolizing use or symbolic value for the people who wear them, would be the generalization I would make on that subject. Yeah, thank you. Great question.
It's a great conclusion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.